Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session where you are going to learn how to build smarter apps when they connect to Office data through the Microsoft Graph. My name is Gina Arenas. I'm a lead program manager for the Office Extensibility team and for the Microsoft Graph. And with me here today, we have Gareth Jones, who's recently joined us as an API architect for the Microsoft Graph. We're going to get started. And in this session, we're going to do a little introduction of the Microsoft Graph for those of you that don't have a lot of context behind it. Then we're going to dive into code and demos. So hopefully you saw some of the demos that I did this morning on the keynote and the demos that Tristan and Jeremy did on the overview session. We're going to go deeper into code to show you some of the cool scenarios that you can build using the API. And in 4 particular pillars. We're going to talk about the Excel API. We're going to talk about People API. We're going to talk about the Find Meetings API and webhooks. We're going to do a lot of demos. And then I'm going to leave you with a call to action, which is start building your applications today. There's a whole bunch of data behind it. We have around 1,000 different APIs behind the graph and a whole bunch of data and intelligence that you can leverage in your applications. Whether it is a mobile app or a web application, you can start using the API to power your application today. So when we think about Office services and the opportunities for developers, there's actually 2 pieces of it. One is extending the experiences within the Office clients, and the other one is tapping into the data that is behind of the services. In this particular session, we're going to concentrate on that access to the data. This was the state of the world before we had the Microsoft Graph. Services that have evolved for over 20 years, and each of them with their own individual endpoint. We have Azure Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Skype, different cloud for work and school, different cloud for personal, different APIs on each of them. And as a developer, if you wanted to build an application that interacted with both, it was a little bit of brain surgery. Now we're making things different. But before we go there, I want to show you an example of actually how all of the different endpoints looked before. This is an example of the existing APIs because we continue to support them. Azure Active Directory, the Windows Live Profile API, the SharePoint User Profile API, Outlook, Office Graph through SharePoint, OneDrive for Business for both consumer and the commercial services. It's kind of complicated, right? If you look at all of these different endpoints, and then they have different styles as well. Now, the world today with the Microsoft Graph is that everything is underneath one single endpoint. That is graph.microsoft.com. And that's the only endpoint that you need to know to access all of this information for both consumer and commercial services. So you can build an application that can access both with the same code. Imagine a native application that can be used to sort out your pictures in your phone, where you send out your expense report to OneDrive for Business and your kids' pictures to your personal OneDrive, all with the same code. And this is how it looks. So you can see how clean it is. You start in graph.microsoft.com. We have 2 versions right now. The beta endpoint, where we have the preview of the latest features that we're putting up into the API, and the v1.0 endpoint, which is the ones that are ready for production use. Here I have examples of getting access to their profile, to your files, to your calendar, to your manager, all of the organizational structure, to tasks, notes, people that you're working with, files that are related to you because they're trending, and so forth. And again, these APIs work for both consumer and commercial services. So what is Microsoft Graph? It's a single endpoint for accessing the data. We talked about all of these different entities that are underneath it. For traversing that data, so you not only get one endpoint to access them, but you can start making navigations across it. So go from a file in OneDrive to the last person who modified that file, or go from a file that is trending around me, and then go and see all of the properties of that file. For accessing insights and rich relationships, we have an example that we showed on the live theater session about trending files. And then it works for both the school and personal. I showed the direct endpoints before, and I want to make a caveat, which is we still have them there. And you're still welcome to use the direct endpoints on the services. What Microsoft Graph is a proxy that sits on top of it, knows where the data is, and smartly reaches out to the services to grab it. So you don't have to worry about where the data is hosted. You just go to the single endpoint. At Build this week, we're announcing new functionality both in the B1 endpoint and in preview. In B1, we're now releasing webhooks for Outlook entities and the general availability of access to consumer services. In preview, we have the Excel REST API, the Find Meeting Time API, and some others that are listed on this slide. Today, we're going to dive into these 4 that are highlighted here: webhooks, Excel, Find Meeting Times, and People API. So let's dive in. Excel REST APIs. For quite a while, we've had JavaScript APIs. We started actually with a JavaScript API that worked across all of the different clients. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook was a common API across all of them. Then we took a step ahead and created a product-specific JavaScript API. So we have a JavaScript API for Excel, JavaScript APIs for Word, that go deep into the objects and constructs that belong to those particular clients. Same thing for Outlook and PowerPoint. But it always requires that you have that interactive workbook opened, specifically for Excel. Now, with the REST APIs, you can call that file, that Excel file that is sitting in somebody's OneDrive, whether it is for a user or for a group, and get access to the content of that Excel file through the REST API. And the object models is very simple. You start with the workbook. Then you can navigate to the individual worksheets. And then from there, you can start looking at tables, names, ranges, charts, and so forth. Full CRUD is supported, and you can navigate between all of these different elements. You can do formatting of the different contents of the cell. You can do visualization. I can call the charts endpoint and get the image back of a chart that is sitting on a particular worksheet. And then I can do basic manipulation of Excel data bindings. Some of examples of those requests, underneath graph.microsoft.com is in the beta endpoint right now because it's in preview. And you will see I'll get the file in OneDrive, so me, drive, items, ID, that gets me that particular file. From there, I start the navigation to the workbook. I can go grab the workbook, the worksheets, arrange, and so forth. Let's take a look at that in action. And from that, Gareth is going to show us this in code.
Thanks very much, Ida. So when we think of Excel, often we're thinking about crunching numbers on the desktop. But I'm going to focus for the next few minutes on an example of integrating Excel directly into the heart of a line of business application. We've got an application here, our Contoso Property Management. Some of you may be seen before. It's a kind of ongoing, ever-growing demo that we build to show our APIs as we launch new APIs, particularly the Graph APIs. And it's a retail property management application. And I'm going to focus on a slice through the scenario here, where a letting property has just had an inspection because there's been a leak. And then there's a scheduler who is looking at the report that's come back from that property inspection. And the scheduler is looking at the costs. that have been estimated around the repair and looking to schedule somebody to go out and perform the repair. So we've got an ASP.NET website here, my application, that's pulling together all of the information about that inspection and letting the scheduling take place. So all this rich information, photographs, videos, coming from Office services. And we're pulling together this data using an Office 365 group. Office 365 group's a great place to collaborate on disparate data. And we've got a group of collaborators here. We've got the property owner, the repair people, the inspectors. So lots of people crowded around this data. And you can see I've got the members of that group there. And I've just pulled all of this data into the sidebar of my application using the APIs on the Microsoft Graph. And I've got some other information. I've got some tasks that they're collaborating on pulled in through the Graph. I've got some OneNote notes that I'm pulling in through Graph APIs so they can chat about what's going on and take notes about the state of the property. And you can see here I've got recent documents. So this is the drive that Ina mentioned, which is the OneDrive on the Microsoft group, and the recent documents in that. And you can see I've got, hopefully you can see the file extension there, I've got an Excel file in there, property costs. And I'm actually now using the Graph API when I click on this ooh, I don't know why that's not working. Yeah. Okay, something's gone wrong there. It's supposed to be a thumbnail there. Well, I was using the thumbnail API on the Microsoft Graph to pull down the thumbnail of the file from the drive, which you can do for any kind of file, not just Excel files, to just get a quick peek at that file. But what's really more interesting is to go and get the deep Excel data. So if I go up here to my accrued costs, then you can see I've got a bunch of line items. And I'm going and pulling this data directly out of my Excel file on the OneDrive for the group and into my line of business application. So let's go and take a look at the code for that. So if I go and look, as I say, it's an MVC application. If I go and look at the controller class for that dashboard, there's an inspection action method. And I'm pulling together a model there. You can see I've got an inspection model class. So if I dive into that, what I've got here is a large method that's going and pulling together all of that diverse data. So it's pulling together the photos and the videos, that kind of thing. So if I get down about halfway through it, you can see I'm starting to pull in some Excel data. And I'm wrapping that up in a little facade class over the Microsoft class to pull that data together. So that's the one I'm going to drill into. That's where we're going to spend our time. And you can see I'm passing in the ID of the group that we're looking at. So there's one group per property. So what do I need to do here? So I've got that list in my UI. That list, when I click on the line items in the list, is actually going to go off and open Excel in the web browser. So I want the URL for the actual document to be able to open Excel in the browser. And I need the ID of the document to be able to drill down into the Excel API and go and extract the data. So I need those two items. So the first thing I'm going to do is go and get an authentication token. So the Graph APIs use OAuth 2.0 authentication uniformly across the entire surface area. So I'm going to go and get that token. I've got a little helper that goes and uses the ADEL libraries to get a token. And having got that token, I'm going to call a method getFileObjectAsync to go and get my two properties about the file that I said I wanted. So I'll dive into that. And what I'm using here is our new SDKs. So we've launched SDKs for the Microsoft Graph. And they really make coding against it super, super simple. And you'll see me use them several times during the demos. So I'm creating a root object for the SDK, my Graph client, passing in that access token that I created. And then I'm just going to drill down through the structure of the graph. So in the same way that you saw the structure being created in the URL when Ina was showing it in the slides, this is the code equivalent to drilling through that in the SDK. So I'm going to go into the groups of the graph, and I'm going to pass in that group ID that I sent in for my property. And then I'm going to go into the drive, and the root of the drive, and the children. And the children is the piece on the OneDrive that lets me go and access the file by name. Because the only thing I actually know about this file at this point is it's the file name, which is that it's propertycosts.xls. So to go and look in that children file, I actually only want to pick out those two fields that I need. I don't need the whole of the data about each file. And the SDKs have a really super simple way of letting you go and pick and choose which data you want to download. So you can keep your round trip costs low. So on that request that I picked out, I'm going to go and filter by name. So I'm going to say name equals Excel name to go and say, hey, I want to pick out the property costs file. And this is just standard OData4 filtering syntax that you can pass into the filter here. And then I'm just going to chain onto that a call to say select and pass in the names of the fields that I want. In this case, the ID of the file and that web URL that I can use in my web UI to make the thing clickable. So super simple. And then I'm going to call getAsync to actually fire the call off over the web. So it really makes the code nice and terse when you're using the SDKs. And then that returns me a drive item object, and so I'm just going to return the first one that I find back from here, because I know there's actually going to be only one in this case. It's a little bit of a cheat there. So I've come back from that. I've got my drive item object, and I'm going to then go and make a call to the Excel API to go and get those line items out of there. Now I've got it. Now the Excel API isn't in the SDK at the moment, because the SDK only covers the generally available surface area of the graph. So I'm going to make a raw HTTP call to call the Excel API. So I'm going to go back to formatting the URL this time. So I'm going to dive into beta, and it's the same format again. The groups, pass in the group ID, drive it down into the drive. This time I can access the flat drive items because I've got the individual ID of the file, so I can go straight to the item. And then I'm going to go into the first segment that says, hey, I want to trigger myself into the Excel API, which is to go into the workbook. And then I know that all of the interesting data that I wanted was in the worksheet called summary, so I'm going to go into the worksheets collection, pick up, the summary worksheet, and then go and look at the tables there. And the tables that I'm interested in is the summary table as well, the summary data table as well. So I'm going to get the summary data table, and I'm going to pull the row data for that. So let's have a look what would come back from that if I was running this. So it's can I make that a little bit bigger? Yeah, that's better, isn't it? Awesome. So what we're getting back here is a standard OData packet, which means that the array of rows is wrapped in a value object. And then all Excel ranges are 2D arrays, where the data is a values type. So I've got a set of 2D arrays for each of the 2 rows in my table with my inspections and incidents and the dollar values that are the totals there. So that's going to be coming back down from that method. And then the rest of the code in this method is just some standard JSON.NET code to munge that return value and turn it into some simple types that I can pass back to my website and display easily. Okay. So that's super nice. Let's actually drill into the Excel spreadsheet a little bit and see where that data is coming from. So if I go and actually look at the Excel data, you can see I've got in my table here that same data we were just looking at, the inspections and incidents with my dollar values. But that's actually being calculated, if we look, from a couple of other sheets earlier on in the spreadsheet, where I've got tables with the detailed data. And here's where I'd like you to think about how this really integrates into your line of business application. So if I'm building up this data, this could be much more complex spreadsheet than this. Here I'm really just summarizing some table data. But I could be doing a whole bunch of tax calculations that are complex state-by-state tax calculations. I could have categories of parts here or categories of types of incidents where I'm having separate markups for different categories of incident that went on, or different labor rates if somebody had to go out on a Saturday or Sunday. And put all of that business logic that's doing those mathematical calculations into Excel, which after all is a tool designed for exactly this kind of mathematical calculation. And so I really don't need to be having that kind of code translated from business logic that I could work with a business analyst that they would really easily understand in Excel. I don't need to go and translate that into custom code. I can leave it in Excel, which is a natural home for it where it belongs, and then just use the power of the Excel REST API on the graph to pull that logic and take advantage of that logic into my app and keep those things separate. Now, of course, what you've got to think about if you're using Excel as a core part of your line of business app like that is, I'm not going to distribute that spreadsheet widely within my organization and have anybody able to just go and mess with my line of business app's core business logic. I'm going to want to lock down the permissions on that spreadsheet a little bit. So, just as you wouldn't let people just casually in your organization mess with the code of your custom application. But it's a super powerful way to divide up your logic between the domain of custom code that you need to produce your custom UI and mathematical logic in a domain-specific tool where it really belongs. Okay, so the other thing that we had in here is that of those individual summary tables, I also had a nice graph of each of them. And it'd be pretty nice to be able to pull that into the application. So let's see how we can go and do that. So go back to my code. I've already added a pop-up handler, so we don't have to spend our time looking at me building UI. So when I go and click on the line item, it puts an empty pop-up, and that's going to go through to my dashboard controller, and you'll see I've got a chart action method that's half completed. So I'm just going to uncomment the null there, and now I'm going to need a new method on my service facade to actually go and get that data from the Excel REST API. So if I go over to my service class, save that, and I'm going to go and add a new service method. And so again, the boilerplate here is just setting up the HTTP call, only this time, because I'm creating a chart, what I want to return back is a stream of bytes that represent the actual JPEG of the chart when it comes back. So the code here, that instead of returning JSON objects, is just taking the JSON, finding a base64 encoded string for the chart, and returning that as a byte stream. The bit that we're really interested in here is the actual call to the Excel API to get the chart. So we're going to go and take a look at what that takes. So again, we're driving into to the group and drive an item into the workbook to get into the Excel API. I know that my charts were on the worksheet. My UI has the name of the chart that I want, and I'm just going into the charts collection and again indexing into that. And then when I get to a chart, there's a bunch of data about the chart, but I'm calling a function on the chart to ask it to generate its image. So I'm calling the image function. And if I'd like the image to render at its natural size, I just pass in a 0, width, and height and ask it to automatically fit. OK, so that should be all I need to do. So let's just go and run that guy up. Ooh. Where was it? Thank you. Yeah.
Cool.
Crowdsourced debugging is the very best. So as soon as that one comes up, hopefully I should be able to go and click on my line item. Taking a little while, longer than normal. All right, so my accrued costs, and now I can go and click on my pop-up. And there we go. I've got my detailed chart just pulled straight down from the REST API. So what we've seen there is pulling that business logic apart from your main application and hosting it in Excel. And I really urge you to think about whether that can really add some value to your app. You know?
Thank you, Gareth. That's a sneak peek of the Excel REST APIs. Documentation and code samples on graph.microsoft.io, so go and check them out. Now, People API. People API is an API that allows to search and browse for relevant people. It uses the source of Azure Active Directory, your contacts in Outlook, and if you have social connections through Outlook, then it brings them as well. So for example, I have my LinkedIn connected with Outlook. So when I go to the People API, I get results from LinkedIn as well. It supports dynamic ranking based on activities on the service. So I can, based on the files that I author, the people that I email, the people that I meet, all of these signals are taken by the People API and calculate all that relevance and ranking to the results that are returned. You saw me doing the typing on the name on the demo for DocuSign. It has fuzzy matching so that even if you mistype names, you get them because they phonetically match. And it also gives me that complete view of the person. I'm going to go to the Graph Explorer and show a couple of things that I didn't show this morning. Can you help me switch this one to here? Mm-hmm. Number 7. Great. So here, I'm logged in with my corporate credentials, ina@microsoft.com. And when I go to the People endpoint, which is actually in beta, what I get back is a list of people that I work with within the organization. Let's do a little zoom. And if we take a look at the results that I get back, the first match is a PM from the identity platform team. The first place where we have the same organizational or like the same boss is Satya. But I work with him really closely. So here's my first match on the people that I work with that is coming from the People API. And if we take a look at the people that I get here, we'll see people from all over the company. This person is in marketing. Gareth is right there. This person works for the Outlook team. So it is calculating all of that based on the intelligence that is behind the graph. Now, I'm also mentioned that you can do search. So I can do $search. And say, for example, bring me contacts that match with Mike M. And I have to just let me do this here and here. So what I'll see is I get back contacts that match Mike Amerlin, and a couple more that are Mike-related contacts. Mike Ellis is another one. And this one in particular, some of them are coming, that you'll see the sources coming from the directory, or other sources coming from my communication history, or let me see if I can find one that says contacts in Outlook. Well, contacts in Outlook as well. Another type of search that is supported is the topic relevance. So I say, for example, I want person names that start with CH around the topic webhooks. There you go. I have matches right there of people whose name starts with CH that I've had conversations around this particular topic. Chax is the PM on OneDrive working on the webhooks infrastructure for SharePoint and OneDrive. I have other examples here of people that are related to that particular topic. Now, I can also see people that are relevant to other people. So for example, let's navigate to Gareth's profile. And let's check who are the people relevant to Gareth. So you'll see, I'll get all of the list of the list of people that are relevant to him right there within the list of results. And again, this is very basic JSON that you can parse and build, people pickers or other custom experiences on top of it. OK. That's a little bit more on the People API. This is 5. And these are a couple of the code samples that I just showed using the Graph Explorer. Now, on to the Find Meeting Times API. This is another one that we demoed this morning, really quick. This one will allow, basically it just takes away the hard work of getting everyone's calendar, figuring out where's the match, and figuring out where you can schedule a meeting with a particular person. You can pass in the attendees and the meeting duration, that's the minimum, but you also can pass in location constraints or time constraints. Say, for example, we all want to meet Wednesday at 1 p.m., and then it finds which Wednesday you can meet them. You can pass in the maximum number of candidates, and it returns a set of meeting candidates with a confidence and a score, depending on how many people will be available on that particular time frame. It also gives you suggestions based on your meeting history, and it works only for Office 365 accounts because it relies on your organizational directory to do some of this calculation. So let's take a look. Let's go back to the example that Gareth was building and take a look at using Find Meeting Times API for the property manager.
Awesome. Thanks, Unit. So we're going to come back to my example and look at now actually using the Find Meeting Times API to go schedule our repair person to go and sort out this leak. So what we've got with the Find Meeting Times API really is the full power of a scheduling algorithm on the grass. So we're really bringing those kind of smarts to you. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that you can really save yourself a whole lot of time in coding. So if I go and look how this fits into the application, you can see down there, it's not super big, is it? Let me make that a little bit bigger. There we go. See down there at the bottom that I'm going to pick a repair person, and I'm using the people pick here, so I'm just going to go and choose Julian. And a date, and I've got tomorrow's date, which is a work day, so that should be fine. And then, ooh, something's not quite working there. Let's pick that again. And there we go, it's worked this time. So I've got a bunch of time slots there, and just typical hour time slots that our dispatcher can offer to the customer to say, hey, are these good times for you to go out and do the job? So let's look at the current code for that. So back to my controller. So this is the controller that gets run to populate the data in that picker. And what's happening here is that a set of time slots is being created with all of the possible time slots during the working day. And then there's a REST call being made to the Microsoft Graph to go and get all of the chosen repair person's calendar events for that day. So the guy, Julian, that got picked, we go and read his calendar and pull back all of his calendar events. And then if I go down here, you see that I walk across the calendar events and order them. And then I go and remove busy times. And what I'm doing here is I'm doing a bunch of maths in this remove busy time function to go and say, hey, let me go and intersect the hour time slots that are sensible to offer customers with the meeting times that the repair person happens to have. And anywhere where there's an intersection, I'll throw away those time slots. And you can imagine there's a bunch of opportunity to get bugs and get that time code on. I mean, it's not super complicated, but it's easy to make it buggy. And this is just about the simplest piece of scheduling you could do, right? One person and a bunch of time slots. Well, this API can actually take, any number of people and build constraints around location and people, so a full scheduling toolkit. So if this simple code can be replaced, then imagine what more complex code can be replaced by. So I'm going to do that replacement, and there's a couple of pages of this stuff. So I'm just going to get rid of the head function here. And replace it with one that uses the Find Meetings Times API instead. So I'll get rid of that. I'll pull in a new version. Oops. And that's not looking so good. Okay, this could be going very badly. So again, I'm using an SDK. This time, the Find Meeting API is in beta, and I hand-rolled some SDK classes just to make the code simpler. And for some reason, the project is completely failing to resolve that Microsoft.graph class, which is going to make this a really bad demo. Because you probably don't want to sit there and watch me try and resolve Visual Studio references to projects. Okay, so what I'm going to do is flip over to a pre-canned version, which isn't quite the same code, but it's close, in a different Git branch. Oops, of course I've got to go and undo my changes. Okay, we're going to undo those changes that I made in the previous demo, just so I can change Git branches. And there aren't any uncommitted changes anymore. Okay, that's really not going to play nice for me, is it, by the looks of it? Okay. Well, what I would have been showing you, in terms of it running, but I can certainly talk you through it, is that I am is that now what I'm doing, I'm just going to drag my code in again, even though it's not going to compile, is that I'm going and creating an SDK class, as previously. And I'm taking my dispatcher, which is the user that's running the web application, and using them as the host for asking to schedule a meeting time. And I'm taking the date that I picked, And I'm creating a time constraint by saying, hey, I've got a time slot between the start and end of the working day from 9 till 6 p.m. And I can just pass in the time zones that I care to work on, so the thing's fully globalized. I'm saying I'm interested in 1 hour duration appointments, and then setting up the attendees that I want at the meeting. In this case, as I say, it's the simplest possible version of that. I've got a single attendee, which is the attendee that I picked my Julian character, who's my repairman, so I'm just setting their email address. And I'm wrapping all of that data up into a time constraint. And then I'm calling my find meeting time API here. So I'm passing in my attendees, my time constraint. This is where if I had a place constraint to set a set of places that the meeting could take place, I'd pass it in. In this case, I know that I'm going to force the repair person to drive to that house, no matter, as long as they have a free time, so it wouldn't make much sense to set a place constraint. I'm setting my appointment duration of 1 hour. I'm saying that there are 9 possible slots in the day, so there's no point asking for more than 9 possible appointments. And then this last parameter true is saying that it's okay to leave me as the meeting organizer out of the meeting, because as the dispatcher, I don't actually want to be present when the repair takes place, so I get to decide whether I'm present in the meeting or not. So that's going to return me now a list of candidate times, and they're going to be nicely organized and ordered, and they're going to be in the duration time that I asked for. So all of that other code I had to do now just completely melts away, or at least it would if it would compile. And all I have to do is transform that into, by selecting that into the kind of shape of class that I want to have in my output UI and return it. And everything else in the file I could have just deleted then. And even if that was a much more complex scheduling problem, all I'd be doing would be varying the parameters of that call, and I just wouldn't need all of that complex code. So hopefully no chance for bugs to creep in there. And yeah, and I won't bring the app up and demo it again since it didn't compile. All right.
Demo gods.
Yeah.
Okay, now to the final one. We're going to talk about webhooks.
Yeah, so webhooks. So webhooks are service-to-service callbacks for the web. So if you've got an app that's using webhooks, you can be connected to notifications of change in cloud services like the Microsoft Graph without having to go and repeatedly poll and keep calling back to a cloud service saying, hey, here's the new data, hey, here's the new data, hey, here's the new data all the time. You can just get told that there's new data instead, so that's much more efficient for everybody on both parts of the calling relationship. So how do you set up a webhook on the Microsoft Graph? Well, first thing you've got to do, you can see on that cloud of your application at the top of the diagram there, actually, is to set up a public notification endpoint. So the Microsoft Graph is going to be calling back to you, so it's got to be able to have an endpoint that it can actually find on the public internet, and that's going to have to be an HTTPS endpoint. We want this to be nice and secure. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is go and create a subscription resource on the Microsoft Graph from your app. And that's going to tell the Microsoft Graph, hey, here's my endpoint, here's the data that I want to subscribe to, here's the type of change that I'm interested in, whether the data is created, updated, deleted, or so forth. And here's how long the subscription should last. So as soon as you try and create that subscription, we're actually going to validate that your endpoint really is live on the internet. We don't want to be sending off messages into the ether or bombarding somebody else's website, for example. That would be really bad, right? So we're going to send that validation message, and we need you to respond to that within 10 seconds, and I'll show you the protocol in a minute. And then assuming that all works successfully, then when there's some change to the data that you subscribe to, we're going to start sending you over HTTPS just simple JSON messages to that notification endpoint describing the change to you. So what's the data we've got today? So the data we have today that we're announcing that is generally available and ready for production is the Outlook data set of mail, calendar, and personal contacts. And then the conversational canvas of group conversations, so the conversations with an O365 group are the first set. And then in terms of a roadmap of what we're going to be rolling out over months to come, and this is roughly in the backlog order that we're working on. They may not quite release in this order, but this is about how we're working on them, is adding webhooks for OneDrive files, for users and groups on the graph, and then for tasks in Planner are kind of the set of things we've got lined up on deck. All right, so let's dive into that and see how that works. So I'm just going to flip over to another project. One go and start that up. Oh, thank you. Okay, so what I'm doing with this project is, if you imagine with my Contoso crowd doing these repairs, imagine that it's a fairly diverse crowd, and a lot of them don't have the same first language. And they would kind of, they're all scheduling appointments for each other, and they would really like to receive the appointments in whatever language they feel most comfortable speaking in. It helps us all to get things that we can just glance through on our calendars. So we thought we'd set up an application that just used the Microsoft Translator facilities to make all your appointments appear in whatever language that you would like them to appear in naturally. So I've got a little ASP.NET MVC app that does just that. So I'm going to dive in. So so I've got a controller here. So you imagine I'm going to go and when I show you the demo, I'm going to go and say, hey, stop the translation for me. And that's going to create a subscription using my webhooks facility. So I'm going to go and get an access token, as I have previously with my other samples. And I'm going to go and make the subscription. So again, I'm using my SDKs to make this super simple. Happily, this time the reference worked. Yay. So I'm going to go and create my graph client for the SDK. And then I'm going to make a new subscription object. And I'm going to pass in, the first thing I'm going to pass in is a client state. So this is a way to help you prevent yourself from getting spammed. So this is an unauthenticated endpoint that you're going to put up there for your webhooks. So anybody could be posting to it. And for you to be able to tell that these are real webhooks that are coming to you from the Microsoft Graph, we let you send a client state as part of your subscription. And then every time we send you a notification, we're going to include that client state along with the notification, so you can tell that it's really us calling you. And then I'm saying that I would like to be notified when the data is created or updated. I'm setting my endpoint URL. And I'm using a tool here called ngrok. So ngrok's a little tool that lets me punch through from the public internet directly to my laptop, which is super nice because it means I don't actually have to go and deploy this to the cloud to go through a debug build cycle. I can just have it actually coming through from the public internet straight onto my laptop. Really great tool. I encourage you to check it out.
So you're using that for it to be your application that is listening for?
That's right. ngrok's providing a tunnel, and that's going to be where I'm listening. And then my expiration date time. And for the Outlook data, you can see I'm subscribing to my calendar events. For the Outlook data source, the maximum subscription time is 4,230 minutes. So I'm choosing to use the maximum subscription time, so I'm just adding that onto now. And that's my subscription. So when that's succeeded, I'm going to get a new subscription object back from OData, from the graph, and that's going to have an ID in it of my newly created subscription. And it's super important that I now then go and save that subscription away, and save with it an OAuth 2 token to be able to actually do some work. Because if you remember, I said that the notifications that are going to come are going to be unauthenticated. So as they come in unauthenticated, unless I've got some sort of token, I'm not really going to be able to do any work to call back to the Microsoft Graph or do anything very useful, because I haven't got a logged-in user at that point. So I'm saving my OAuth 2 refresh token indexed along with my subscription ID. So when that notification comes in, I can look it up and use that to go and do some work. So what does it look like when I do that work? So the first thing that I'm going to look at is my validation. So this is how easy it is to do that validation. All I'm going to do is I'm going to get given a query parameter with the validation token, and I just have to echo that back as quickly as possible as a standard text plain response. And I've got 10 seconds to do that, so that should be something I can do synchronously pretty easily. And assuming that works, I'm going to start getting notifications posted to me, and I've just got a little Poco class here to receive the notifications. And when they come in, I'm just doing this again synchronously in line here. You'd actually probably in a real application want to go do this on some background thread. You've got 30 seconds before we start assuming that something's gone wrong and start retrying sending the messages. So some things you could do synchronously, but in general, you'd probably not want to clog up your front-end thread pools, so you'd probably want to go and post it to some background. So what I'm actually going to do here with the notifications, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check that client state. We said we'd send it with every notification. So I'm checking that it's the same value that I originally sent in, so I know that this isn't a spam notification. And then I'm going to go and look up in my user table that I saved my subscription ID and OAuth refresh token in, and actually just save this in some Azure table storage. So I'm going to look that up, via subscription ID. And then I'm going to use ADAL via a little helper that I wrote to convert the refresh token back into an access token, which is what I need to access the graph. So having got my access token, I'm then going to create my SDK class again, familiar pattern, passing in the access token. And I'm now going to use the Outlook calendar aspect of the Microsoft Graph SDK to go and read and change the calendar title and do a translation. So I'm actually spinning up the low-level event request object out of the Graph SDK. This is one of the great things about our Graph SDK. You saw me navigating through the structure of the graph earlier, building it up piecemeal. But it's a very open framework, so I can just dive into the middle of it. If I've got here, as I have, a chunk of URL, I can actually just build the object directly with that chunk of URL. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. So I'm making an event request for a calendar event. And then I'm pulling on that with a GET request with a GET async. So having done that, I'm getting the subject out of that, checking that I haven't already done the work. So I've got a little separator, which I'm using as a token between my translated version and my non-translated version, so I don't translate it infinitely as the change happens. And if I haven't seen this one before, then I'm calling a little helper to call out to the Microsoft Translation APIs and translate into the language of my choice. And again, I stored that language just in my Azure database. And then, assuming that all worked nicely, I'm then just using the update CRUD function on the Graph SDK to send the event back again, just passing in the simple property on the event that I want updated, which is the subject, and off I go. I should have written that out. So let's see if this one's working. Cross your fingers for me that I have more demo look this time, and off we should go. Okay, so I'm going to go sign in. And I'm going to choose Dutch, which is the only other language I really know anything of other than English, and ask to start translating. And there we go, I've got a subscription. So now I'm going to flip over to my calendar, and I'm going to say, hey, let's create a new event in my calendar. And I'm going to say, go and repair leak at property. Oops, property, spelt it correctly. Okay, so now that should be working away. My webhook should be matching on the thing that I subscribe to, the calendar events, and working its way through the system. And there we go. I've got reparatie leakage, something or other. It's scrolled off the screen. Okay, I shouldn't have chosen quite a big name, but that was my big chance to show off my Dutch, wasn't it? And I kind of blew it. Reparatie leakage eigenschap-ish, maybe, okay. I'm not that good at Dutch. But anyway. There we've got just using a very simple webhook to just put in a nice piece of business logic to just make life easier for the good folks at Contoso. So, you've seen me demo the SDKs a whole bunch. And you've seen that we've announced the Graph SDKs. .NET SDK is generally available for the feature sets that we've released on the Graph is generally available. So where you're seeing APIs that are under the 1.0 part of the URL path, those are available in the generally available Graph SDKs. For iOS, we have a release candidate available now for you to download and go try, and we'd encourage you to go and give us feedback on any last little nits, so we can get that pushed to a general availability state, hopefully in a very short few weeks. And then in a few weeks, we'll have a release candidate available for Android as well. And then a bunch of other platforms we'll have rolling out in coming months for other common web platforms. So whatever you're working on, we'll have an SDK for you. And you saw me passing in that access token. I'm mostly in my samples was using ADAL to get that access token and just passing that in. So you could be using the released ADAL libraries to go and do your auth if you're against the 1.0 auth endpoint for Active Directory authorization. If you're trying to use our new preview libraries, you could bind those in yourself pretty nicely as well, the new MASL libraries that Vittorio announced today. And if you're not so keen on using preview code, but you still want to use the generally available 2.0 auth endpoint, then we've got sample code to show you how to hit that directly with HTTP in one of our samples that you can bind in. So all of these SDKs are built with a code generation technology that we've optimized with templates to generate what we hope is really nice idiomatic code for the platforms we're targeting. We're not trying to generate C# code for iOS or something like that. We're trying to generate code that's good on the platforms we're targeting. And we'd certainly like feedback if we slip up there anywhere. But the tools to do that, we've also published as open source. So if you go to our new GitHub organization, Microsoft Graph, you'll find all of the Viper tools that we use to do that and the templates for the platforms. So you can take those and regenerate against the OData metadata for the Microsoft Graph. If there's something you don't like in the SDKs, you can go and generate your own. You can have a go at generating against the beta endpoint. Some things will work, some things won't work, but the things that you might need might just work. So totally encourage you to go and have a play with those. If there's something you don't like about the shape, make an SDK that suits you more. So we're pretty proud of those things. Seen lots of SDK demos. So graph roadmap. Where are we going? Well, we've got a really strong roadmap for the graph. I mean, hopefully, for those of you who've been following along across the last couple of conferences, you've seen us come along and deliver on the promises from our earliest previews through releasing at our Connect conference last autumn to adding more services. And we're going to carry on adding more and more. And so the sort of things that are, again, on our immediate to-do list to go and get more services onto the graph, Microsoft Intune, our device management solution. You also new Skype APIs released today, super exciting. We're working with them to see how we can get those onto the graph as soon as we can. SharePoint lists, I'm sure everybody will be super excited to get SharePoint lists. I know loads of people have got SharePoint-based applications that they'd really like to get migrated onto the graph. So those kind of things, and then a whole bunch more teams internally that we're talking to about how we can get their APIs onto the graph. We want to get more smart intelligence. I mean, hopefully what you've seen from today is a bunch of the value that Ina and I have demonstrated that we can start to add to the graph, whether it's the smarts inside the people API that goes and says, hey, these are the people that you would want in a particular context and that contextual data, or whether it's having a complete scheduler on the graph via meeting times. We want to add more and more of that.
Yeah, and there was a live theater session that we had yesterday that dived into more of the intelligence that is behind the Microsoft Graph and some of the functionality that is coming along. For example, getting the documents that are trending around you, or your recent attachments, or the recent documents that you have viewed or modified. All of these things are coming in within the beta endpoint of the API, starting with trending around and recent attachments.
Cool. So we want to add richer querying. So you saw me doing some of those filters. You saw Uni doing some searches. We want to add even richer ways to navigate through the graph and be able to query through it, taking more advantage of the fact that it is a graph and it is a connected model. And also, we recently were able to release the graph with one of our partners in China. You should expect us to be doing more of that as we release the graph in more regions around the world with local endpoints. In the long term, think of this as the place where you expect Microsoft APIs to show up. That's very much our ambition. It knows no bounds, I think it's fair to say. We want to be the place where you can come as a one-stop shop and have very low tax to use any API from Microsoft. One sign-in, one URI namespace, super easy developer experience. So come to expect that from Microsoft. That's where we're going with this technology.
Okay, so we're going to recap some of the things that you've seen today. We went and talked about Microsoft Graph, one API, graph.microsoft.com. You can even type this in your browser right now and go. It will redirect you to our documentation portal. And you can use all of the data behind the API to get access to all of the information that is in Office 365, not only to the data, but also to the intelligence. You can easily traverse across all of the different objects. Because it is very basic REST API. Any device making capable of making an HTTP request can talk to the API and get access to the data, but it's always underneath our secure promises for data access. Here are some of our partners that have already built integrations on top of the Microsoft Graph. If you're representing a company here today, I want to see your logo next year or in the next conference. Okay? At Build, we have lots of presence around Microsoft Graph. There's a couple of sessions that workshop sessions that we're doing later today. So please join us. Join us to learn how to use the API to build, using Cordova to build mobile applications, and then also one on web development. If you've seen on the Expo Hall, there is a section where we're doing the Code Lab challenges. We have 11 different challenges that use the Microsoft Graph right there, so you can try and within 15 minutes have an application that talks to the graph. So go and try them up as well. Here are the links to our documentation portal and the places where you can get the code samples that we use today, the GitHub repos.
Oh, there's one sample there we didn't have time to show. There's a great sample there that's a universal Windows app that's really good for exploring the depth and breadth of the Excel API. I really encourage you to check that out. That's up there.
If you have any questions, the hashtag is Stack Overflow. I'll take the question. Just in Stack Overflow, hashtag with the tag Microsoft Graph, and in Twitter with hashtag Microsoft Graph and hashtag Office 365 Dev. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for coming and watching this session. Now we're going to open up for questions.
I have 2 questions. So the first one,
go to the mic.
The first one is, so you mentioned about the verification token that the client gets once for the notifications. Is it tied to the IP address?
No.
Or, so which means if I have the verification token, it can be used from a different device?
It's just a one-time token.
It's a one-time token, so
Yeah.
there is no security around that, which
No, it's
prevents
just a
me
token that we send to say, it's not a security mechanism, it's an anti-spam mechanism.
Okay.
So just to make sure that the endpoint is up and that you're not creating subscriptions pointed at your worst enemy,
Right.
so we go sending your worst enemy messages, because that wouldn't be a nice thing to do.
Okay, thanks. The second question, if I can. Yes, for the notifications, you said that Graph will give like 10 seconds for the client to respond. What happens if the client doesn't respond in 10 seconds?
So 10 seconds for the validation token. If you don't respond within that 10 seconds, we'll just cancel the subscription you just tried to create, and it'll be as though it never happened. For the actual notifications, you've got 30 seconds before we decide that the attempt has failed, and after that we'll get into a cycle of exponential retries, where we'll kick off a retry cycle where we'll retry once, and then we'll leave a bit bigger gap and retry again and retry, and we're still tuning how many times we'll retry and over what period, so you can expect to see
With exponential
that.
back-off.
But it'll get progressively longer and longer.
So if it's a part of the workflow basically cancels, right? You don't like proceed with the next step in that workflow if the client doesn't respond at some point. The reason I'm asking is if there's a business critical logic in that notification, then I don't want the workflow to continue if
Yeah, so
it fails.
you shouldn't be thinking of this as a reliable pipeline in that way, because it's the internet, right? It's going over completely over the public internet. Who knows whether you're down for a short period of time, we're down for a period of time. This is not guaranteed service in that way. You can build on top of this a reliable pipeline by saying that for a webhook notification, and this is common pretty much to all webhook platforms, not really specific to ours, that what we would do is we would essentially have a backup poll that polls perhaps now, instead of, perhaps previously you would have polled every 15 seconds or something for something important, perhaps now we'll poll every hour or day maybe even. And then what we'll do is, when we get it, the data coming in, we'll actually call back to the API and say, hey, what's changed since I last made an API call? And not really pay too much attention to what's in the notification packet. Just actually call back and say, hey, since I last called, I'll remember the timestamp when I called. And since I last called, what's changed? And if you do that calling pattern instead, then you've essentially built a completely reliable pipeline at least to the granularity of how often you poll. And at that point, you're using the webhook to add to essentially to be a super optimization in between those polling times to make everything more efficient. But you've built a reliable pipeline that you can depend upon at that point.
Thank you.
Chuck in the red.
I think we can take that
Okay.
question over there. Take a minute
Okay.
to complete the
We'll be
evaluation form. We really appreciate your feedback, and we'll see you next time.